Good evening, everyone. It's Doug, the registrar, and I have one of the co-chairs of the exam committee here, Brooke Martins, and we'll be going in about 5 minutes here. Just looking at the participant list, we got a few people on, and we'd ask you to make sure all your mics are muted, and we'll use the chat window to pose questions, but I'll get back into all that detail in a few minutes here, but we'll start up at 5:30. And if you've got a problem with your audio or anything else, you don't need your video on. We're not live streaming video or anything. If you want to, if you're having any issues with the setup or logging in, just chat something or put something in the chat window and we'll respond. Brooke's monitoring that. Doug Kristofiak, the registrar, and as I mentioned before, I have Brooke Martins here, co-chair of the professional exam committee. I don't believe David Strauss is joining us tonight, the other co-chair, but we have a lot of information to get through tonight because I'm kind of covering two topic areas out of all the reading subject areas on the preparation website. So the professional practice and the college policies and procedures. So lots of information to go through. This is a new format, the Zoom. We just purchased it today. So I apologize for the late send out of the link. We'll try and be a little bit more proactive in the future, but we noticed that our Adobe Connect subscription expired, and we were looking for a cheaper alternative and hopefully a little simpler. And to me, this one seems a little simpler and user-friendly. But just an orientation to the platform on the participant side, whether it's at the top of your screen or at the bottom. If you float your mouse over, you should see some icons there. There's one with participants for 14. If you click on that, you'll see the chat box. And you've got some icons at the bottom there, raise a hand. I encourage you, if you do have a question, let's address it as we move through the slide. And I might be on to the next slide, but I'll go back and Brooke will prompt me if there's a question in the chat window and I'll look at it and try and respond. But better to do it that way while it's fresh in your mind rather than wait till the end of 24 slides and you might have forgotten what your question was. So I hope everyone can hear me okay. We've got other people in the office monitoring and I get the thumbs up that the volume's okay. So we'll start and welcome everyone. I'm going to cover two topics today. And bear with me as I get used to this as well. I'm just going to move out of here and go to the website for a second. I hope that everybody's been into the professional exam prep webinar page, listing all the webinars and the exam preparation. But I just wanted to show you some things on here. Note that we do have another webinar coming up on September 27. It's going to be a little bit of a different format. We don't have an in-person study session anymore. We're trying to do more stuff online with webinars. And we have a panel type format where we're going to cover about 6 areas and each speaker will give about a 10-minute overview of their topic area. But you guys will have to have done your homework before you attend the webinar. And we ask you to go through this prep exam website and look at the reading lists and look at the videos, look at the past PowerPoint presentations that were done in study sessions or any recordings we have in videos, and come prepared so that these topics are fresh in your mind. And then, as I said, Tim will go through integrated land management for a 10-minute spiel, and then each one will go through, and then we'll open it up for you to ask any clarifying questions or something that you don't understand. And I'm sure the speakers will be available after too through email if you've got some questions after that. And you could correspond through email. But one more coming up on September 27th. And as I apologize today, we're a little late in sending out the link and that, but we'll be a little more ahead of it on the next one. And under the, remember we keep talking about subject areas, and these are very specific to the exam. So today we're covering professional practice. I hope you'll go in and take advantage of all these documents here and audio. And also a second topic I'm covering today is college policies and procedures. But as we move towards these panel webinars, and if you go back and review some of the previous webinars that we've recorded and posted on site with the PowerPoints and the audio, then you'll see the topic areas fitting into all these gray shadowed boxes. But basically that means there's going to be a question. There will be questions on the exam relating to these topic areas. And I think David stressed that at the last beginning webinar. So my outline today, I'm going to talk about the general intent of professional regulation, why we have regulated professions, talk a little about the difference between how you register and become registration eligible. Then what we're looking for entry standards to be met, education, things like that. Talk about practice once you are a regulated member, what you're responsible for, continuing competence, mandatory, things like that. Want to stress the whole intent and mandate of professional regulatory organizations are that we're here to protect the public interest. And we want to talk about all those entry and practice standards and registration requirements, and then ongoing things that we all are subject to, like complaint resolution, that protect the public interest. And then this is a little bit dry, but I want to go over, give you a good grounding of how we regulate professions in the province and how many there are and the different types of professions. And then point out the different regulatory regimes, because a lot of you might have heard of everything, of terminology like, we're a right to practice regime, or we're a right to title regime, or we're certification or licensing. What does all that mean, and how does it all tie together? And then I'll just walk you through a brief slide on a history of how we've evolved in the forestry profession, basically going from the Societies Act to a right to title regime to a right to practice today. And then I'll talk about the Act and some specific sections there about mandatory registration, which you should know. And then I want to dwell on restricted and controlled activities. We are a mandatory registration regime, right to practice, and we are also can restrict certain activities that only forest RPFs and RPFTs can do. And then there's other restricted activities in the province, like in the wetlands areas and reclamation, that relate to other regulated professions, and that so biologists, chemists, engineers that can also do those sign-offs. But there are specific ones that are only relevant to foresters. Then I just want to quickly talk about the Act, regs, and bylaws and ethics. I'm not going to get into the nth degree of detail, but I will point out some key parts of the Act that you need to be aware of, especially the complaint resolution process and how that ties in with ethics, and also what kind of the level of detail you need to know in the regs and the bylaws. And then obviously with our mandate being public interest protection, I wanted to mention the role of the public members, not only on the governing council, but complaint resolution process, and how important they are to ensure that the pro is maintaining the public interest. I also want to give you just a brief overview of how we regulate forestry profession across Canada in 8 different jurisdictions, and then I'll open up for questions, but feel free to ask a question on the chat box at any time. And I just see somebody put a quick point up about that. Okay. So why do we regulate professions? And obviously, as I already mentioned, public interest, and obviously in some professions like the health professions, there's health hazards, there's safety hazards. You don't want a building falling down on you or a bridge, so the engineers are involved. And that's where government of Alberta and governments in many provinces and territories start to regulate the professions and start setting entry standards and practice standards. So it's to protect consumers from harm, and that harm can be from incompetent or unethical behavior. It can also be given that we My third harm can be direct or indirect, given that we operate on the public provincial crown lands with the public land base. It's pretty evident that we make a lot of decisions. Many of our members work for industry and government. We're obviously making lots of planning decisions, and we have a duty to consult with the public. But I think the government sees that as a third party, that we're kind of the stewards of the land base and coordinating all the different users. And since it's a publicly owned resource and an important resource, not only economically, but because we could environmentally degrade it if we didn't do things right, reforestation, following certain laws and standards, we could easily be finding ourselves without a forest and replacing it. So I think that's part of the reason that we've evolved as we have in the forestry profession, because we often play tag team with tourism as the fourth largest sector behind oil and gas and agriculture. So we are one of the top resource industries, and we contribute a lot to the direct and indirect employment. So profession is granted self-regulation, and I think the important part I want to make, government grants that, but it's a privilege, not a right. And I think you've probably seen in the news media over time that in the health sector anyways, when budgets were cut, and there was a whole issue about in the health professions when they didn't have the budgets at the hospitals to sterilize the equipment properly and somebody died or got sick, the government stepped back in and said they didn't like the way the regulated professions in the health sector responded to that. So it's a privilege, it's not a right, and we have to earn that every day that we're regulated. And if we step out of line, or an accountants are seen as doing something wrong, and everybody loses their hard-earned income on an investment issue that should have been seen, then those factors will play out, and the government will step back in, and they could actually remove that right. So, and typically, obviously, the health or the safety of the public comes paramount, and that's what dictates how much granted self-regulation status we're going to have. And so I think that's important to cherish that and treat it as a privilege. And it gives us a certain market advantage, but we don't want to abuse that and lose that right. And so how do we do that? Regulated professions can raise a practitioner's level of ethical and competent behavior. And we'll talk about ethics and standards of practice and the expectations of certain behavior in the profession, and the way, obviously, we have to live up to policy and legislation and statutes and regulation that oversees the harvesting of timber and the replanting of it and all that stuff. So those are all standards that we have to live up to. And if we don't, we won't have a forest to manage. So I just want to dwell on this last bullet. We raise that public interest protection by entry and practice standards, and we set those, monitor them, and adapt them over time. So I just want to dwell on entry standards. The ones in blue text are some of the key things that we look at as you come to register with the regulatory body. Education, assessing your good character and reputation, and your legal ability to work in the province. So those two bullets we look at before you join, and that's kind of the key basis of what college you're going to join, whether you have a diploma or a degree, and whether it's accredited or non-accredited, and you have to go through competency assessments. But then once you are registered based on that education in the right college, and we've assessed that you have good character, whether you're a transferring professional or not, and you don't bring any baggage of complaints or disciplines from another jurisdiction, we register you. And then the bullets in red text are things that you'll work on while you're a regulated member, usually at the in-training registers. And that's the work experience where you're going to be under a sponsoring or a mentor. And that can be an RPF or an RPFT, and you're going to do that for 24 months. And that's after you finished your degree or diploma. So that's all part of the practice standards that or entry standards that you're going to have to meet before you can elevate to the RPF or RPFT register. And of course, the last one is the professional exam, which you're preparing for tonight. And once you've met all those qualifications, then or requirements, then you can elevate to those certain registers, and then that affords you professional sign-off ability in specific areas. And then the last bullet, I just wanted to mention that in some of the professions that there's a requirement that you carry professional liability insurance. In our act, it's silent in the regulations, but we encourage all consultants, whether you're a one-person operation or a 10, 15-person consulting company, we encourage that they carry professional general and liability insurance and commercial general liability insurance. So typically that's errors and omissions insurance and CGL. And that it's important that you maintain that in case there are some errors or omissions or wrong calculations or whatever, or there's some screw ups. So that's important, but it's silent in our regs. But in some of the others I'll talk about later under professional sign-offs, it's actually a requirement that you carry a certain amount of coverage. So that's the entry standards, which I said you can work on as you are in the in-training registers. But then once you are in training, or you elevate to the RPF or RPFT registers, we call them practice standards. These are things that apply to you once you are a regulated member. So we're always under codes of ethics and standards of practice. And under the CAPFT environment, those codes of ethics are duties to the public, duties to clients, duties to a couple other. And in the Foresters world, your CAPF world college, it's basically RPF same. And you should be very familiar with those because there's a real strong tie-in with the complaint resolution mechanisms, the third bullet. And of course, once you're a member, you're subject to mandatory continuing competence program requirements, meeting certain minimums and reporting that annually. And these are all parts of maintaining a good standing besides paying your membership dues, keeping your register and database information up to date so we can contact you at work and home and get in touch with you if there was a complaint matter or anything else, and maintaining your CCP activities, continuing competence, and all those requirements. So those all apply to you once you're in the college as a regulated member. So that's a lot of times people will ask me, well, how do we protect the public interest? That's our mandate, but how do we do that? Well, I think I just mentioned a whole bunch of things, but I'll summarize them in this slide. And really it relates to public accountability, and go back to, I apologize, the slides I'm looking at, I noticed after I didn't have numbering on them, so I've numbered them, and when we post this with the recording on the website, I'll make sure Grace has the numbering on the slides so you can go back to them. But have a look at slides 10 to 13. And it's basically the mandatory registration provisions. Forestry is important enough that anybody practicing under the scope and is going to be subject to being accountable to the public and their peers, and fall under all these complaint resolution processes and all that. As all part of that, there's that peer and public review, and anybody in the public can complain about your practice if you're doing a poor job. And it's obviously, when it goes through the complaint resolution process, you're going to be reviewed by your peers. And there's some very good documents on the website about by David Curtis about the law of professional negligence and things that you should all read up on. So, and having a due diligence defense to make sure you're not going to get in hot water if you did have a complaint against you. We set a defined scope of practice, section 1 of the Act, 11U, and that's where we police mandatory registration provisions. Anybody working on provincial crown land and doing anything under the scope of practice for forestry is required, if they're eligible to register and be accountable to the public and the profession. Protected titles are there so that the public can distinguish between members and non-members. Those are all outlined in Schedule 1 and 2 of the current Act, the Regulated Forestry Profession Act. So these are all signals how we're trying to protect the public interest so that they can distinguish who we are and how we differ from non-regulated members. I mentioned the Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice, essence of Part 4, which is a bulk of the Act. It lays out all the procedures on discipline and complaint resolution, orders and tribunals, and I'll get into that on a future slide. But it's a very well-defined complaint resolution process with all the appeals, and so that you know your rights if you're ever called in on a complaint and you become an investigated person. And the complainant launching the complaint has to know the process and the appeals and all those as well. So Part 4 of the Act is very detailed, and it's long, and it's a majority of the Act, but it's a pretty important thing to look at. And I'll have a slide that kind of slices out the key and important parts of the sections of the whole Act that relate to that. I mentioned the continuing competence program. It's mandatory, have to meet certain hours. So that's another way we ensure that members keep up to date on their competencies and skills so that they can provide competent professional services and not get themselves into hot water on a complaint. Practice permits are public documents. You must show it if you're requested by the public or another member to show it that you're in good standing, or any conditions on your practice permit and conditions on your practice. So review Section 30 of the Act relating to that. Establish and maintain the entry and practice standards, and I went through those in two slides, slides 4 and 5. So I think that's all well laid out, and those are all elements of how we protect the public interest as well. And then, as I mentioned, the professional sign-offs come, and those are usually reserved to regulated members and maybe in different professions, but only they can do them. So not any Tom, Dick, and Harry can do it. This is just an overview from 30,000 feet. I just wanted to give you an idea of how broad the regulated professions are. There's almost 50 in the province, and they're under numerous statutes. Back in around the Act, the time our Act was coming into play back in 2000, the Health Professions Act went under a major modification, and they actually started realizing that doctors and nurses and a lot of health professionals were doing similar things. So they actually moved away from the exclusive scope regimes in the doctors and the nurses areas and started regulating with what we call right to practice through mandatory registration and restricted activities, because they were finding that a lot of the things that health professionals do, like giving needles or putting IVs, doctors probably didn't want to do those anymore, but nurses were probably more proficient at doing them than doctors. And it just made sense to start controlling things by saying this is a restricted activity, but here's who can do them in these regulated professions in that health sector. So they merged all 27 professions under one Health Professions Act. And that's the way it stands today. So some of the elements of our mandatory registration and our Regulated Forestry Profession Act actually we took excerpts out of that Health Professions Act because that was the newest piece of legislation at the time back in 2000. So on the non-health profession side, these are 23 professional regulatory organizations, and they exist under 9 acts. All those are policed by Alberta Labour Minister, and especially the professional governance unit staff that we deal with as we go through our regulation and act changes and hopefully become a regulatory body of one for the profession of forestry with AAFMP. And there's another umbrella legislation. When we were granted the Forestry Profession Act back in 1985, the government got tired of handing out individual acts for each profession area. So they came up with POAR, and that stands for the Professional and Occupational Associations Registration Act. And that actually is umbrella legislation, just like the Health Professions Act, where now 13 regulatory bodies exist under that, and they're all typically right to title regimes, and I'll get into those regimes in a minute. And then we fall under the 8 that are right to practice regimes, and 5 of those are the exclusive scope of practice ones, like the engineers, the accountants, the architects, the veterinarians, and the land surveyors. And then there's 3 under the MR, mandatory registration, restricted activities model, all right to practice regimes, but those are the agrologists and the forest technologists and the foresters. And then there's other legislation for the legal profession and the teachers, making up those 25 non-health sector. So you don't need to memorize that. Sorry about the acronyms, but that's just a kind of a broad picture of the regulated professions in Alberta. So we don't stand alone in forestry. So now I wanted to talk a little about these terms I raised at the beginning of the slideshow about licensing regime, right to practice, RTP. You'll hear these terms over and over, and you'll see them on the exam. And I'll just flip to the next one here. Also, you'll hear about certification regime, right to title, RTT. So I just want to spend a few minutes explaining the difference between those. Licensing is in 2 shapes. As I mentioned, the engineers and architects and land surveyors are in the exclusive scope of practice. That means, as you read through this slide, that they not only regulate practitioners that practice engineering, anybody that does the practice of engineering must be registered or working under the direct supervision of a PEng if you're in the engineering world. So that's what they talk about, exclusive scope of practice. The other element that those types of regimes have are that they license businesses as well. So you've seen the accountants, you've seen the engineering consulting firms, they're all licensed by the regulatory body as well, and you have to redo that annually. So that's part of all that exclusive scope of practice regime, which is a right to practice regime. We, the agrologists, foresters, and forest techs, fall under this new kind of model where the Health Professions Act went, and that was mandatory registration. And then they added in those restricted controlled activities, as I said, giving a needle. I'll get into it on another slide on professional sign-offs and approvals and the detail there. But bottom line, under these 2 types of licensing regimes, either one, your registration is mandatory. You practice in that defined scope, you have to register and be accountable. And you're probably the only ones that can do sign-offs or approvals of certain documents and that. So that's a key difference there. And obviously, in both cases, certification licensing, there's protected titles, yet and you can't use those titles unless you're a regulated member in good standing. So I think it's obvious that why would the government give out these 2 types of regimes? I think as you start to see the health and safety of the public at risk, especially in the Health Professions Act, you see them moving towards mandatory registration with restricted activities, right to practice. In the engineering world, the architecture, you don't want bridges falling down on you or buildings. So that's a very high safety issue. So they start to restrict who can do the practice and regulate them. And therefore that makes it a better environment to protect the public interest through safety and health hazards and avoid those things. And you want competent professionals doing the practice, and you don't want anybody stepping out of line. So obviously imposing all those complaint resolutions processes on them and ethics is all a good thing. So in Alberta, they call it the P5. It used to be the P7, but when they merged everything, you see this a lot in professional regulation as well of professions, that they're tending to condense and merge, and that's exactly what happened to the chartered professional accountants. There was 3 different bodies: CPA, CMAs, and CGAs, and now you're seeing them all come together as a CPA, a chartered professional accountant, and that's why it went from P7 down to P5 all of a sudden. And our sister province across the mountains, BC, they are an exclusive scope regime, and they've been around for over 60 years. So And forestry is obviously their number one industry in that province. So that's why they get a different type of regime. So just wanted to emphasize on the last bullet, the agrology, forestry, and forest technologists under that mandatory registration and restricted controlled activities model. So what are we today? We are a right to practice regime. Okay. Now the lower form of regulation is the certification regime, right to title, and that is purely anybody wanting to use protected titles, like a pea biologist or a pea chemist. They fall under POARA. Those people will register to use that title. Certain professions now have been granted restricted activity sign-off and approvals, especially in the wetland policy area and in the reclamation remediation area. But you all know that Annex 2, the Alberta Forest Management Planning Standard, those restricted activities are the sole domain of foresters and forest technologists. So biologists or chemists or anybody else cannot do those activities. But these certification regimes are totally voluntary registration. And that is the difference between a right to practice and a right to title regime, or certification versus licensing. So keep that in mind. And I think the only other thing I would say is about it's the importance of protecting the safety and health of the public or the resource. So that's why you move up. You usually start off as just under the Societies Act, you get organized, and then you move to government and request that you should seek professional status with protected titles and perhaps restricted activities. So you start moving up the ladder to these certification regimes. And if the government deems the health and safety or the importance of the resource, like environment degradation, is pretty important, then they will move you up to a licensing regime, right to practice. So I like this off the Alberta Labor that oversees all the non-health professions, the 20, I believe I said there's 25 or 23 of them. This was a good overview statement. It's always the safeguard of the public interest. And then those 4 bullets kind of summarize a lot of the entry and practice standards and things like continuing competence, mandatory codes of ethics, complaint disciplinary, and some of the pros even have practice review mechanisms, like in the engineering world and the accountants. They can go into a business and start to review your practices. And you can see where that's pretty important, especially in the accounting industry, when you're doing review engagements or formal audits. If you're not following proper procedures in that audit process, you can be called on it by the regulatory body. And you might be denied being able to do that as a consulting business. So as I mentioned, we've evolved over time. Both the foresters and forest technologists at one time were registered just under the Societies Act. And then in 1985, the foresters began to be regulated with protected titles. But at that time, we were a certification regime. It was purely voluntary. And at that time, I think we had about 350 members join. And we kind of hovered at that level. But over time, the foresters thought, well, there's a lot of people out there that could be registered, but they're not. They're not coming forward voluntarily. And it was usually those people that are painting the profession with a bad stroke in the public's eye. So we lobbied government and said, I think this forest industry sector is pretty important, that we should be moving to the next level of right to practice. So, and then at that time, the technologists were geared up under Societies Act. They were interested in becoming regulated too, and subject to ethics and discipline and all those things. So when we revisited the Act, the Forestry Profession Act, and created the Regulated Forestry Profession Act, lo and behold, in came the forest technologists, and we became a right to practice regime, a licensing regime. And we still have protected titles, but now we're regulating the forest technologists for the first time under one common scope of practice, but we had 2 autonomous regulatory bodies under that one act. And then professional sign-offs evolved over time with the planning standard, especially Annex 2. And sorry, should have turned off my phone there. I apologize. Then, just to give you an idea of the future, the merger of the colleges, we're hoping on proclamation in the end of the year here, just December, January, or the spring, and the regulations have to be approved by cabinet. The act has already gone through the 3 readings and received royal assent, so we're crossing our fingers that we'll get that, and then we will become the AAFMP, the Association of Alberta Forest Management Professionals, under the Regulated Forest Management Profession Act, and we will be one regulatory body for the professions, much like the BC model in over across the mountains. So now I wanted to turn to the Act for a bit, and one portion on the exam, you will see questions about mandatory registration, and we police this every day. But it's a pretty important Section 40 of the Act. A person must apply for registration if the person is qualified or eligible to meet the sections. And my next slide addresses Section 22.2 of the Act about who is qualified or eligible. And then should know all these 3 points, intends to provide any or all of the following professional services on public land. There, our act is provincial authority, a jurisdiction. So as I mentioned before, it's the provincial crown lands. Or if you're teaching in the practice of the regulated profession to future people of the profession, members of the profession, or you're supervising regulated members. But the key word here is when we police this is qualified, or I use the term eligible in Section A there. And then that takes you back to 22.2. Well, who is eligible or qualified to be registered and must register? And that's where we take a look at your educational credentials, those entry standards. And obviously, if you've got a Canadian Forestry Accreditation Board accreditation, accredited degree, it's a no-brainer. You're eligible. If you have the NAIT diploma, you're eligible. If you're a transferring professional from another jurisdiction, you've already met entry standards, probably written jurisprudence exams or professional exams, it's a no-brainer. You're eligible too, because if you've already reached that designation, there's no question in our mind that you should be registered. So, and then Section C of the 22.2 is basic catch-all, and it kind of speaks to our competency assessments for both technologists and foresters, where we look at work experience, combinations of academic coursework and that, or degrees, diplomas, and upgrading in education to see through all those combinations of things if you do meet the basic accredited program or approved program, education-wise. So that's who's eligible. So just a question I pose to all, if you had a biology degree and you were working for TOCO up north, do you think you'd be eligible to register with our college? And so I know everybody's on mute, but I'll answer that question. First of all, we look at your education entry standard. We'd say, no, you don't have the right degree. You don't have an accredited degree. We can't force you to go back and take the forestry degree. So there will be people in a mandatory registration restricted activity environment regime that are allowed to practice forestry but are not eligible to register. And that's one key part of this mandatory registration that I think the government needs to beef up to help us capture more individuals that are practicing forestry. But if that biologist had a biology degree and he was registered with a biologist, then it's, in our minds, they're regulated by the ASPB, Alberta Society of Professional Biologists, so the public interest is protected. So even though they're practicing forestry, we hope they're registered with a biologist. But again, that's a voluntary regime. So not all biologists that practice biology or forestry are registered either. So that's a bit of a glitch to our legislation that I'd like to see beefed up. So we will get people practicing out there that are not registered, but believe me, even in exclusive scope regimes, not everybody that practices engineering is registered either. You will have some consulting firms where the firm has to be registered, and you'll have one engineer, PEng, with the seal, and they will do all the approvals of any restricted activities. But you will have, since the other people working there are working under the direct supervision and they're not doing the sign-offs, they allow them to do the practice of engineering. So it's not a perfect world in either of these right to practice regimes, but it does cast the net quite a bit further versus right to title regime where it's voluntary to register. So just keep those aspects in mind, but we are required to police mandatory registration provisions, so we take it very seriously. And I think I've kind of dwelled on this enough, but we obviously have the accredited Canadian Forestry Accreditation Board that accredits university degrees across Canada, and there is no accrediting body for the forest technologists, but the NATE is the benchmark and everything's measured against that. So there are a number of programs approved across Canada that they've already reviewed and said they're equivalent. So basically, if you've got any of those, you're eligible to register. And the whole emphasis here, I tend to see a lot of professionals coming from other jurisdictions, and they say, well, I don't do professional sign-off, so I don't really have to get registered, or I don't use the title. As long as I promise not to use the protected title like RPF or RPFT, can I practice? And the answer to that is it comes down, our mandatory registration provisions comes down to the individual practitioner, where you practice. As I said, provincial crown lands, and if you're doing something under the scope of practice, then you are definitely qualified and eligible to register, and the colleges will seek legal action to make sure that you are registered. So MR won't capture everybody, as I mentioned. There's lots of private land out there. There's lots of federal crown land, or national parks, or it's not to say that we don't have members registered in those organizations or those lands, but our jurisdiction is provincial based, and so we're a little limited in applying MR to some of those other areas. Now, you will see something on the exam about registration, and people always kind of misinterpret this as, you know, the entry and practice standards and that. But when you apply to the colleges, I just wanted to stress registration requirements of what we're looking for. And obviously we're looking at the educational entry standard, but there's some other things that we're looking for. Are you lawfully or legally permitted to work in Canada? Do you have Canadian citizenship? These are all things laid out in our regulations that you must meet as well. If we're assessing your good character and reputation through character references, and we're checking with other jurisdictions that you're transferring from, and you have a code of ethics issue or a hearing tribunal outcome, that may affect your registration in this province. It may deny you registration, or it may require us to put practice permit conditions on. Make sure that you work under a supervising forester or whatever. But these are all bullets that kind of relate more to the registration. Yes, we're looking for the educational entry standard to be met, but we are also looking at other things like lawfully being able to work here, being a Canadian citizen, having good character and reputation, and assessing that in a number of ways, and then obviously having language proficiency and paying your membership dues and staying in good standing. And if there is a requirement, if you're doing any specific sign-offs that are outlined in government policy or regulation, then in some of those cases you would have to carry professional liability, and that is the case in reclamation remediation professional sign-offs, that you must carry a certain amount, and in some cases you must have so many years of experience, 5 I believe in the rec rem area, and in the wetland stuff you have to have a minimum of 3 years of experience. So those are all important things to think about in registration as well. Just wanted to dwell on restricted activities and sign-offs, and the way it's evolving these days is the government as they can't do all the checking and monitoring here, when they start having a restricted activity, they tend to turn to the regulated professions, and it may not just be the forestry profession, it may be many others. And you can see that in the wetlands of the reclamation remediation. I think it's a pro 10 in the wetlands. We had 10 different regulatory bodies involved in that, and all are eligible to do sign-offs, except the land surveyors. And the reclamation remediation, we had, I believe it was P6 and now it's P7 because the Society of Engineering Technologists became regulated and fell in under the APEG Act in the engineering and geoscience world. So certain regulated members, usually on the full registers after they've been through all the exams and met all the entry standards, those are the ones that are eligible on certain registers to do those sign-offs and approvals of plans, certificates, prescriptions, assessments. And these are in place all across Canada in many of the exclusive scope regimes. If you go to Ontario or BC, you'll see this as well. And I encourage everybody to have a good read of the Forest Management Planning Standard, especially Annex 2 and the number of sign-offs listed in there. Everything from forest management plans to certain things under the TM regs. And there's another, again, wetlands policy and reclamation remediation or other areas where there's requirements. And there's usually a requirement that you have experience in there so many years, and that you may even have to carry errors and omissions or professional liability insurance to a certain level. So often we ask the question, what's entailed when you do a professional sign-off? What duties should you keep in mind? And usually when you sign off on that plan or approve a document or apply your professional seal or signature and registration number, you're taking responsibility, accountability for that work. You're ensuring that your work is accurate, reliable, free of all errors and omissions. Did you directly supervise the work? Or did you hire a bunch of people, not train them, and send them out in the field? And then that could come back on you later if those people screw up, and that is a sign-off event. We had a case in BC where somebody was doing sign-offs for regen surveys, and that's a requirement in Alberta too. Well, the person that did the work, there was a snowstorm one day, and they made up the data in the truck. Well, their supervising forester caught that, looked back at the dates in the calendar and said, how could this guy have done these regen surveys when everything was under 2 feet of snow? Well, that FIT never worked in forestry again. So be careful here and make sure that you're supervising and who you're supervising. And if you are going to have people working under you, make sure they're properly trained and they're doing the work properly, and you're supervising, you have quality control and quality assurance aspects in mind so that you are doing some checks on them to make sure that they're doing it. So these are all the things that are so important when you do a professional sign-off and take accountability and responsibility for that work. You better have all these things in order. As I mentioned, Part 4 of the Act is the biggest bulk part of the Act. It has to lay everything out in detail, from notices to orders and hearing tribunals and who all the key people are. This slide is my effort to point you, narrow you down in your focus of not memorizing all of Part 4, which is tens and tens of, or almost 100 pages, I think. But you should take a look at what makes a valid complaint, and these bold font or the sections of the specific act that you might want to might want to take a very close look at, and to the point of memorizing some of it, because you may see a question on the exam about them. But what makes the valid complaint, and how does it tie to your ethics, and who can make it, and against whom and when? And there's even provisions in there where after you've retired or resigned from the association, the regulatory body can still go after you 2 years after. So just be aware of all these things. Understand the key roles and the key players, from the appointment of the complaints director and hearings director, to you as an investigated person, to the complainant, to complaint review committees, to hearing tribunals, lots of important players there and processes. But most importantly, understand what signifies unprofessional conduct, and that's in the definition section of Section 11GG of the Act, and there's quite a number of them. So you might want to be familiar with that. And obviously negligence and incompetent practice would be probably unprofessional conduct, but lots of others listed as well. What are the complaints director's options to resolve a complaint? Can they dismiss it? Can they refer both the complainant and the investigated person to alternative complaint resolution? Can they call a hearing tribunal? Whatever. You need to know what their options are to resolve that complaint. And usually they'll send it to investigation before an expert report before they'll even, one option is not even to call immediately a hearing tribunal. So be aware of all those options to resolve a complaint. What are appeal levels for both the complainants and the investigated persons? Very important sections. The complainant, once a complaint's received by the complaints director, they have a timeline on them to resolve it and issue how they're going to resolve it and their reasoning. If they're going to dismiss it, they have to give reasons, and usually we have legal counsel involved in that. But there's certain appeal levels to that if that complaint is dismissed. And likewise, an investigated person, if a hearing tribunal is called and they're found guilty of unprofessional conduct, they have appeal levels too. And you should be aware of Section 76 and 79 about going to the governing council for the first level of appeal and the Court of Appeals for a second level of appeal. And then also Section 71, it's very important that you realize the outcomes of a hearing tribunal and what your peers could assess conditions on your practice and that come out with orders. Those can range from fines to upgrading your training to working under the direct supervision of a mentor or sponsor or some direct supervision of another professional, but lots of different orders that can come out of that, and you should be familiar with them. Also, an important element that was added to this legislation, you're seeing it in a lot of the PROS legislation, is the ombudsman oversight, and look at Section 96. And that's more of a process-related aspect where the ombudsman can get involved. So if the complaints director, I'll give you an example, if they dismissed a complaint and then didn't tell the complainant that they had the right to appeal and how many days they had the right to appeal, if the complainant made a complaint to the ombudsman's office about that process and said, well, I didn't even know, I wasn't even told I could appeal this and I had a time restriction, well, the ombudsman's office could come in and slap our hands and make a ruling, and we would have to jump to attention and fix our processes. So there's always that ombudsman oversight, but it's usually process related. Just as we talk about Part 4 of the Act, and if we do find yourself in a hearing tribunal, there are other regulations attached to the Act, and that's the expenses and review fees regulation. And you might want to read through those briefly. You don't have to memorize it, but what is the general purpose of that regulation and when do they apply? And I'll tell you right now, it applies to hearing tribunals. And if you are an investigated person guilty of unprofessional conduct, it's very likely that there's a number of things in this regulation that you could be charged back for, along with certain things like fines or taking coursework or whatever, or you may lose your practice. But if you've gone through a hearing tribunal and are found to be guilty of unprofessional conduct, this regulation allows us, the college, to recoup some of those expenses of putting you through that hearing tribunal and appeals and everything else. So a healthy chunk of that money could be on your back to go back to the college, especially if you're unprofessional. The RPF regulation and the Regulated Professional Force Technologist regulation, it don't need to memorize this, but you should be generally aware, and depending on what your college in, you should be generally aware of the different standards of entry for each of those registers for regulated member. The titles, those are outlined in Schedule 1 to the Act, and then dwelled upon in the regulation. The release of public information from our registers, and the renewal of practice permits and reinstatements. So you should be generally aware of it. And then be familiar with the different regulated and non-regulated registers and the registration requirements. And I refer you back to slide 15, which when they're numbered, it'll be easy to find. Bylaws they're pretty dry reading, and we're revamping them as we merge, but they're basically the day-to-day operations of the colleges. So you'll want to be having a read through those. Don't ignore them, especially important areas like the election process and governing council and officers. And one key place is standing committees. And we're not going to say what level of detail we get down to. We're not going to say what % quorum do we need for a meeting or an AGM, but I think you should be well aware of certain standing committees and how they differ from other ad hoc committees or as needed committees like hearing tribunals and complaint review committees that are only struck when needed. But you should be very familiar with a lot of the standing committees in each of the colleges. And I can't help but think, going back to the Act, there's a competency committee expressed and there's a registration committee with specific mention of the makeup in the Act. So you might want to review those standing committees and their general terms of references, because you might get a question on that on the exam. And then obviously those bylaws lay out dues and fees. And as we move to AAFMP, a lot of these bylaws will be condensed down and put into policy and procedures, and you'll see a much refined or streamlined set of bylaws in the future. But that's your general day-to-day operating along with your policies and procedures. Codes of ethics and standards of practice, the whole essence of Part 4 of the Act relates to this. You're going to be, if somebody's going to lodge a complaint, the first advice that I give them is that you need to look at the Code of Ethics and you need to specifically state how you think the person breached them, one or more, and be specific with your evidence and all that stuff, because that's what it's all about when it comes to investigating a complaint. And are you guilty of professional misconduct or unethical or unprofessional practice? Did you breach one of these codes of ethics? So in the RPF's aim, you should know those verbatim. Look at the standards of practice that gives you some guidance, and there's even some do's and don'ts guideline sections under each standard that talks about the do's and don'ts and where you could get in trouble. So be very familiar, because when you come to the exam, you could be looking at scenario situations and you'll have to pick out where the person or persons might have had a breach of ethics and then defend that answer with some of these standards of practice and the do's and don'ts and the guidelines. And of course, on the CAP-FT side, depending on what college you're in, your duties to the public, duties to the client, duties to the profession, and there's one other duty. But then all those are broken out under that, and they're very similar in nature. But whatever college you're in, you better know those verbatim, and you better be very familiar with that. And one example I'll give you is one of the standards is address conflicts of, or one of the duties under the ethics, or one of the ethics is address conflicts of interest. You might want to read up on that one, because it's a pretty important one. And yes, you will find yourselves in situations where you're in a conflict of interest, but what do you do about it? And the ethics and standards of practice documents will give you some pretty good guidance in that area. Again, primary mandate of the professions is to protect the public interest. So the government ensures by the Minister of Alberta Labour appointing public members. Review that in section 12 and 13 of the Act, and be familiar with what these public members are there to do and what their capacity is, and the college does reimburse them on their travel expenses and pays them, or actually not the college, the government of Alberta actually pays them. We stay out of it. So it's a third hand that they get appointed by the Minister of Alberta Labour, and they're paid by the government of Alberta to attend meetings and represent the public interests. And we have quite a diversity of public members not only on the governing council, but also on the complaint resolution. So if they're ever striking a hearing tribunal, there's a percentage of 25% that has to represent the public. And so these public members step in on the complaint resolution side for complaint review committees or hearing tribunals, and they also serve on the governing council. So I just remind you to what other ways do the colleges protect the public interest, and I refer you back to slides 4 through 6 and 10. Just an FYI, how the profession of forestry is regulated across Canada. And basically, we have 8 provinces regulated. PEI and the 3 territories are probably not likely. They don't have the volumes of the forest or the number of people to really get government interested in regulating the profession in forestry. But Manitoba's a different beast, and they've been considering it for a long time. But I haven't seen any action on that front. But across the 5 provinces that are listed, we have 5 right to practice regimes. Licensing regimes, and then we have 3 right to title. The maritime provinces are all right to title voluntary registration. So, and it's the 3 western provinces that regulate forest technologists, and whether that's under one regulatory body or that's the way it's going. It will be one regulatory body in each of those provinces regulating both foresters and forest technologists. So I know that's a lot of information. I hope you'll refer back to these slides. I'll take any questions, and maybe we'll try on this new format to unmute everyone, or you can unmute and so other people can hear you. But if you'd rather not sit and type for 10 minutes in the chat box, if you do have a question or a clarification, I can answer that. Before I go into the questions, though, I'll just say, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, go back to the forestry preparation website on the CAPFT site. All the links are there, all these references, and they're all under those topic areas. And there's a lot of good information there to explain some of the things I've talked about today. And I think that will really help you prepare for the exam. And before everybody takes off, we're going to end a recording here. But we also have a little poll that we're going to make available. Brooke's going to bring up, and we'd encourage you to take a few seconds or minutes to complete it and submit it, rather than waiting till the end of the month and the next webinar, and then you've got so many topics in your mind that you don't remember what did we talk about that day or whatever. We'd like to give us a little feedback on this new format, this new platform, on the presentation today, and we're always looking to improve in the future. So I appreciate it if you take the time to spend a few minutes and give us some feedback. Anything else I've forgotten, Brooke?
No. Maybe how to get to the chat box, because I haven't seen anybody using it. Or it didn't automatically come up when you log in like it does in some other platforms.
You launched the polls. Where is it?
I have launched the polls.
Participants. Help me out. I got IT guys in the background here. Phil, too. Is it under participants, Phil?
Nope.
No?
No, it was under more.
More, sorry. Chat on the admin side here. So what I'm looking at is all the participants online by name or initials, and there's I believe you just go in and you start a chat to everyone, and you don't make it private or anything, and you should just be able to type a question in there, and then it'll pop up on another chat screen from whoever it is to everyone. And if you do have anything, or if you want to unmute your mic and try the audio, we're happy to do that as well. Anybody still out there?
Yeah, people still signed in.
Okay.
They're doing the poll, which is awesome.
Thanks for that feedback, everyone. I'm not looking at the answers or anything. It'll all go in anonymous, so we don't see that.
And that we are recording it. We will make it
yeah, and so we have recorded this. The audio, the PowerPoint is there. Not all the links to the other web pages I was showing there, but this PowerPoint and then my recorded voice is there, and the slides will be numbered and they will be up on the Commons within the week, so that you can, and anybody that couldn't make it tonight, please let them know, and we'll be sending out a mass email to all the eligible writers. And most important thing and pass the word to other potential writers. We promoted this seminar and the next one, or the webinar and the next one, to all potential writers. It doesn't matter whether you're writing this fall or next year. The sooner you get to these webinars and you start using the prep web page and looking at the resources, the much better off you are going to be able to tackle the exam. So I can't emphasize that enough, is come to these webinars as soon as you can, because they're going to really narrow your focus. And I hope my presentation today really narrowed down your focus on what you need to know in the Act and the regs and the bylaws.
And we don't always have webinars for every topic for every exam. Exactly.
So Brooke was just mentioning we can't cover every topic on the website there before each exam. So there's a series of previously recorded, and we're trying to improve the quality of those over time. But we always try to put a new one up in a new topic area, and as the exam is dynamic and it changes over time in topic areas, we will try to schedule new seminars to address those. As you can tell, the Land Stewardship Act came on not too long ago, but it's one act that's pretty superimposed over lots of legislation, the Forest Act and everything. So that was a key different change in government policy and stuff, and planning. And so that is part of the exam now and one of the topic areas, but 10 years ago you wouldn't have seen it. So we change and we're dynamic. And as the AAFMP is created, you're going to see lots of change and streamlining of bylaws and streamlining of the Act and streamlining of the regulations. So you'll have some new things to study. I see a question there. Can we claim a CC hour on this training? Yes, you can. Typically, I don't know what time is it. We start at 5:30, so you probably claim an hour. And it's structured learning. You're listening to me on the CAPFT side, and it's I would say it's LPPP level 1 on the CAPF side, legislation, policy, and professional practice. So, and as we move to AAFMP, our continuing competence mandatory program is going to become much simpler too, with 2 categories and minimums of 75 hours over a 3-year period. So all these things are eligible for credit in those areas. Hope that answered Stefan's question.